science and technology. James today will be talking perhaps a little bit more about creating practice research in the context of his own art practice, but I'll be probably talking a little bit more about what surrounds practice researchers as concerns in carrying out this research. This is going to be quite a long presentation, so brace yourselves. Therefore, I just wanted to run you through the contents. First of all, I'll give some context to the reports, what's practice research and how can practice research be shared. And then I'll do some grounding for the concepts of practice research, what we mean by them. I'll show some examples, pretty much the only time you'll see images, so apologies for that. And there's a section called From Practice to Practice Research and Creating Practice Research. Some challenges. I think at this section we can do a bit of brainstorming and I can maybe ask your opinions on that a little bit. And then Miranda has also asked me today to talk a bit about what reports so far have done in the real world after they got published. So that's our outline. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. If you would like to slow me down or want me to repeat something, I'll be happy to do it. I've got an accent, so it may be a bit hard to hard to get. So, the reports. Before we begin discussing the practice research in detail, I want to give some background to much of what you will be hearing today. Most of the findings and thinking we will talk about today is drawn from two recently published reports that were commissioned in 2018 and 19 by the Practice Research Advisory Group UK, which is a professional body in England for practice research, and Research England as the funder, and support was given from Central School of Speech and Drama, Goldsmiths and Coventry University. The reports were founded upon two core questions. How does practice research enrich our ways of knowing and understanding the world, and how can it be shared? These are two separate but interrelated questions. What follows are some of short quotations from the practice reports, which will highlight the pressing need and opportunity that's emerging from this new and thriving field of research. So, like every good researcher, I'm going to quote us, ourselves. In practice research, forms of intuitive, embodied, tacit, imaginative, affective, sensory ways of knowing can be conveyed, and its sharing presents an opportunity for the modernizing and revitalizing of research communication, uncovering novel dissemination routes in the digital era. What's important here is that practice research affords wholly new ways of knowing to be conveyed. It opens up areas of knowledge that until now have proven an ill fit to more traditional forms of research, such as quantitative research or qualitative research. Not only this, because it's a new field of research, it must develop its own systems for sharing its work, and practice researchers as a community have a unique opportunity to revitalize the way research communication and dissemination works. This is a quote from the preface to the report by Stephen Hill, Director of Research at Research England. Practice research is a new way of thinking about and engaging in research, and so needs new structures and systems to maximize its impact within and outside the economy. I think you could almost argue that practice research is in a position to be inventing its dissemination for the digital era, and can learn all the lessons about what's gone wrong for over 400 years in written research communication, and actually get it right, rather than be stuck with a 16th or 17th century model that we are trying to fit into a different world. These aspects of practice research are emphasized in the preface. As you can see, there's a unique opportunity to reflect on the way we are conducting research and its dissemination. I want to talk a little bit about the methods that we employ while carrying out this research for the reports. We talked to 62 direct participants from across disciplines and institutions in England. We did face-to-face interviews with researchers, practitioners, but university research managers as well, publishers, research support professionals, systems administrators, funders. All this kind of variety of people make up the research ecosystem within which a research field flourishes and is situated. We prepared questionnaires and surveys, we sent them out to research support professionals, funders, and policymakers. I'm quoting some of them later on as to what people said in terms of the questions we posed. And we also did an in-depth literature review of theoretical texts, including technical standards for storing and preserving practice research. It's important to emphasize here that practice research exists across and beyond disciplines, and it's vital that conversations surrounding about it is with a variety of people. So here's the reports. They are published as open access on the British Library Shared Research Repository on 1st of April 2021, and you can download them for free. I think maintaining it as an open access downloadable file with a Creative Commons license is particularly important for both of us. I'm going to talk about open access and practice research in a little bit, but what we wanted to achieve here is for reports to be available to people without institutional affiliations or money to buy individual publications. A little bit of grounding. Before we go any further, I think it's vital to establish some principles when we're talking about practice research, so please forgive me while I establish some groundwork from which to proceed. And those are things like practice research, etc. Practice is a vital and contemporary concern, and its use within the language research is new, as one of our interviewees, Bruce Brown, observes. He says, I don't think the word practice was ever used in common language until the first research assessment exercise in 1986. So it's important to note here that we're not seeking to provide definitions as such, but we're looking to outline territory and establish a language with a view to bring some clarity to some of the concepts we are discussing. And any attempts to define or prescribe attributes of practice must be undertaken cautiously and driven by the certainty that the bounding and constituency of its meaning will continue to emerge. Practice is characterized by what theorist Donald Schoen has called as unique events, dealt with strategically by the practitioner. Practice is the work of real-time cultural extension and transformation. Almost any form of behavior considered as practice, as one of our interviewees, Ben Spatz, has observed, if you look at practice theory, everything is practice. It's exactly this openness that ushers in new and overlooked manners of discovery, inspiring questioning of established research methods, and progress in the communication strategies of research. Philosopher Andrew Pickering, who we also interviewed, refers to practice as a dialectic of resistance and accommodation. The practitioner chooses between multiple approaches to find what Schoen has called their own way of combining them. In practice research, researchers outline what's happening when they do practice. This may involve any number of unique and bespoke methods that can be conveyed by a research narrative. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about research narrative later, but bear with me while I outline practice first. Practice is an experiential mode of inquiry that, when located in a research framework as practice research, reveals and shares insights and understandings that expand our capacities for knowing. Historically, there has been a consideration that research is superior to practice within hierarchies of knowledge. In terms of funding, support mechanisms, and literature, we can do that. Researchers are supposed to provide the basic and applied science form from which to derive techniques for diagnosing and solving problems of practice. Practitioners are supposed to furnish researchers with problems for study and with tests of the utility and research results. The researcher's role is distinct from and usually considered superior to the role of the practitioner. And this new research field can challenge that and be a way to democratize research forms. Technical rationality was institutionalized in the professional curriculum in England and is still the dominant model of knowing within the academy today. Practice research can challenge this. Processes cannot easily be conveyed as descriptive knowledge, nor can they be confined to analytical frameworks of logic and mathematics. Practice research is where knowledge becomes knowing and action through practice, reflection in action. Put simply, knowing what is important, knowing how is crucial. In terms of the definition of research, in the OECD first Carter manual, we find that research and experimental development comprise creative and systematic work undertaken in order to increase the stock of knowledge, including knowledge of humankind, culture, and society, and to devise new applications of available knowledge. In 1962, when physicist Thomas Kuhn defined a paradigm as sufficiently open-ended to leave all sorts of problems for the redefined group of practitioners to resolve, he challenged the conventions of positivist research and its core study body of knowledge. Knowledge became knowing. Across the 20th century, higher education institutions in England were guided by what Schoen has called a view of knowledge that fosters selective inattention to practical competence and professional artistry. The challenge for practice research then, whether for researchers, policymakers, research support professionals, all those people that I listed earlier, is to create a clear and well-reasoned mechanisms that counter this inattention. And these reports are in a way an attempt to achieve that. For one of our interviewees, Bruce Brown, the production of new knowledge is rarely the outcome of research. It's often about challenging existing knowledge in order to establish its limitations rather than creating new things. To Bruce Brown's comment, we might also add that it often establishes new potentials, not just new limitations. So I'm going to quote the definition of research from REF 2014 guidelines. For those of you who may not be familiar with REF, I can see some young faces, and I guess maybe students. REF is a nationwide research assessment exercise that happens every 6 or 7 years. And universities are allocated what's called a quality-related funding based on the results. And in REF 2014 guidelines, REF offered a new definition of research, a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. And this definition was also used for REF 2021. We found in our conversations that this definition was widely agreed on by researchers, policymakers, and research support professionals. Now there's a question of the name practice research, the term, so to speak. The term practice research initially emerged from discussions between academics from PRAG-UK, Practice Research Advisory Group. These academics were Anne Waddington, Simon McVeigh, Maria Delgado, Andrea Phillips, and Martin Reno. And around 2015-2017, they looked to simplify the term to refer to practice research. It's been simple and conjoining of method and inquiry, and the term avoids any equivalence or discipline specificity, defining as a clear and distinct character of research. And this is also an umbrella term that we used in the reports. However, we also looked at variations like practice-based research, practice-based research, etc. And we outlined some information on those as well in the reports. We hope that the use of practice research as an umbrella term will shift the focus of practice researchers away from the discussions and definitions and more onto the work of practice research itself. The umbrella term practice research frames a field that exists across and beyond disciplines. So traditionally, when we say practice research, lots of people may think it has to do with disciplines like arts and design. However, practice research exists across a variety of disciplines, and we're here today with, of course, Cal and PSST. Some examples of practice research methods that sit underneath this umbrella term may include artist research, art-based research, arts research, artistic research, performances research, action research, close to practice research, embodied, participatory, practice as practice-based, and practice-led research. It's also important to note that we were looking not to be prescriptive. Practice research varies across and beyond subjects and disciplines, as I mentioned, but there are also many possible balances of practice and research and potentially multiple methods present in its operation. So that is not to say there's a one-size-fits-all definition of practice research. The term may refer to a research fields within which different models of practice research may sit. Research narratives in practice research outputs can take many forms, be in any format, and work best when they effectively articulate the research inquiry. This point is to bring a bit of clarity between what we mean between different things when we use terms like practice research or practice research, because we find there is quite a lot of confusion between the research field, the methodology, the outcome/output. When things like file formats, text, multimedia, etc. come into play, then it becomes really difficult to distinguish between these terminologies. So in the report, we also look to clarify those, and I'm going to slide later on to describe what we mean by each of these things. We did dare to come up with a definition, which wasn't an easy exercise, because this can be a highly debated thing. There's a lot written about practice research or its variations, and attempting a definition was probably one of the most difficult aspects of this report. But we did, and we describe it as a type of research where practice is the significant method conveyed in research outputs. And every word in that sentence was chosen very carefully, and we ran through multiple reviewers to make sure that our language wasn't excluding certain disciplines, subject areas, or being too prescriptive. So this is a broad framework, just an attempt to clarify and describe what may be what we may mean as practice research. It then can be challenged, but at least the focus would be moving away from defining, but actually focusing on other things that the field may need, which I'll come to in a bit. In a practice research output, a research narrative articulates the research inquiry that has emerged in practice. And research narrative is the key thing here, especially when we talk about practice versus practice research. And the distinguishing feature tends to be the research narrative. Practice research enables researchers to share ways of knowing that emerge in practice. It is unique in foregrounding intuitive, embodied, tacit, imaginative, affective, and sensory ways of knowing, which may be overlooked in traditional framework. When we interviewed various people from across disciplines, this was brought up by them as well. For example, one of our interviewers, Bruce Brown, said, whilst practice research is only 30 years old in terms of public funding, older universities are 600 years old. The discrepancy in funding and support that practice researchers receive needs to be urgently redressed to ensure the parity of funding within the research landscape. For forensic scientist Danielle Moncrief, who was another interview, there is a clear and pressing need for improving funding for practice research across all disciplines. We do now have quite a few scientists who speak up about the fact that we need practice research, and funding bodies need to be funding it. Practice research affords a vital opportunity for enriching how we understand the world. It expands the scope and nature of research, both inside and outside academia, and it's important to emphasize when we say research, we think about universities mainly, or academia. However, we need to also recognize that research goes outside academia as well. Practice research develops methods for capturing and sharing knowledge creation that may not be catered for by traditional research types. It provides a clear bridge between professional or creative practice and research. It enriches and informs scholarship and teaching. For professional practice here, one can also read creative practice, We found the term professional practice to be more broadly applicable and in less direct conflict with the understanding of practice as innately creative in and of itself. It's a crucial discussion within practice research and one we'll come back to. Practice research also develops the technologies used to share and communicate research. As I briefly touched upon before, practice researchers tend to use a variety of output types, which may include multimedia, which traditional research forms may not. Practice research recognizes the non-linear aspect of many research inquiries. It revitalizes and refreshes systems for academic peer review. It propagates knowledge exchange within, across, and beyond disciplinary boundaries. So you're looking at a research field where there's a lot of potential and a lot of scope for change. Okay. The bits with the images that I promised turns out to be an image of an operation. I'll find out an image of toaster later. So this is from the work of Professor Roger Nevon and Professor Abigail Woods. They undertook simulations of historical surgery techniques, and they named simulation-based reenactment, SBR. They document their processes, and they published a research narrative of their inquiry, as you can see here in academic visa publications in PubMed and British Medical Journal, academic journals. So in their case, the practice research outputs are in the form of a journal article, which can be the case. It can be a book, but it can also be a film or video. The Toaster project is by Thomas Thwaites, who is a designer who completed his master's in design interactions at the Royal College of Art in 2019. His work received several awards and is exhibited internationally at galleries in London, Dublin, Rotterdam, Tokyo. Based in London, he's currently working on a commission from the Wellcome Trust. I'm going to read a little excerpt that was used to introduce his work. It's quite engaging and hilarious. Hello, my name is Thomas Thwaites, and I have made a toaster. So begins the Toaster project, the author's 9-month-long journey from his local appliance store to remote mines in the UK to his mother's backyard, where he creates a crude foundry. Along the way, he learns that an ordinary toaster is made up of 404 separate parts, that the best way to smelt metal at home is by using a method found in the 15th century treatise, and that plastic is almost impossible to make from scratch. In the end, Thwaites' homemade toaster, a haunting and strangely beautiful object, cost 250 times more than the toaster he bought at the store, and involved close to 2,000 miles of travel to some of Britain's remotest locations. The Toaster project may seem foolish, even insane, yet Thwaites' quixotic tale, told with self-depreciating wit, helps us reflect on the costs and perils of our cheap consumer culture, and in so doing reveals much about the organization of the modern world. You can also see here, there's a talk if you're interested to learn more about it, and he also chose to publish a book about the project. The final example is a documentary film about individuals who participated in the Indonesian mass killings of 1965-66. It's called The Act of Killing. Michael Ubemedibo at the University of Roehampton is producer on Joshua Oppenheimer's film. This practice research project develops reenactment techniques in documentary film. As I mentioned earlier, one of its components is impact, which basically is case studies of how research goes around and makes a change in the world. I won't read that. That's just a visual, and I'm glad I won't read that. It is an impact case study submission by Ubemedibo for the University of Roehampton. I think there were a couple of different impact case studies for this work. The research on reenactment in non-fiction filmmaking contributed to the development of innovative methods and approaches to documentary practice as a means of precipitating critical national and international reflections on the histories of political violence. The act of killing demonstrates the potential of film production and exhibition as a means of popular mobilization and political intervention through which accepted discourses around history and genocide are framed. The work has made significant impact on different contexts, and those are all outlined in the case studies. From practice to practice research. In the English Academy, one of the most common problems we heard arising in the field of practice research was the relationship between professional practice and practice research. While this is an issue that deserves its own proper analysis, I think it's important to detail how challenges surrounding creative and professional practice is resourced and supported in higher education institutions in England. So we will explore some of the most salient issues here. The rabbit duck illusion is a famous ambiguous image from the late 19th century in which a rabbit or duck can be seen. After being used by psychologist Joseph Jastrow, the image was made famous by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who included it in his philosophical investigations as a means of describing two different ways of seeing that versus seeing as. The earliest known version is an unattributed drawing from 1892, an issue of Latte, a German human magazine. And the caption was, "Which animals are most like each other?" with answer rabbit and duck written underneath. In the same vein, when we look at a project, we can look at it as practice, and we can look at it as practice research. It could be the same thing from different angles. However, a research narrative needs to be present with it. For the vast majority of practice research outputs, it's not possible for research audiences to experience the practice firsthand, and as a result, documentation is employed as a proxy for practice. This may be relevant to some of your projects, maybe as students. You may wish to put an exhibition or put an event somewhere, and your assessors may not be able to go there. For example, if you do it internationally, logistically, it may be difficult. And it goes for PhD students as well. And in this case, most practice researchers employ documentation as the next thing to introduce the elements of the project. Practice researchers should not feel a requirement to present their research in a non-linear, cross-media and complex item types. In some instances, a journal article or book chapter may be the most appropriate avenue for research narrative. Again, we're talking about the dissociation between the research field and the research output, the product. A practice research output, as practice and research narrative, may be shared in any item type or format. That could be text, performance, film, sound, recording, audiovisual software, etc. as long as it conveys the research inquiry. As one of our interviewees, Thorsten Reimer, who was at the British Library back then, he says, you can use whatever medium you want as long as you find something that is suitable. Professional and creative practice need not always become practice research, and both areas are vital for a healthy and prospering higher education environment. I think it's important to be honest with ourselves and have an honest conversation about this. As I mentioned earlier, practice may potentially be overlooked, and in the hierarchy of research, practice may not be respected as much. First of all, there's a need to change that and give practice the recognition it deserves. Therefore, people do not feel the need to fit their practice into certain boxes to receive funding and to exist in this ecosystem. Practitioners may feel that they need to frame their work as practice research in order to gain time and support for it. That is a situation that can result in poor quality research outputs, aiding neither practitioner, institution, nor the field of practice research as a whole. So we really need to look at this from a very honest perspective and say, is this practice or is this practice research? It doesn't have to be practice research because practice itself is equally respectful. I mentioned REF earlier, the quality-related funding and money that the university receives from the government. So QR incentives of research assessments such as REF in England can exacerbate this situation. As Stephen Hill, the head of Research England, which is one of the 4 funding bodies that commission REF, just to give context, he says, I think there's a really interesting debate surrounding the area that not all practice is research, and I think that's an honest debate. If someone's a composer and they want to say, there's no research in what I do, it's a creative activity, I produce music and that's what I do, well, that's fine, but let's not try and squeeze it into a research box if that practitioner doesn't think that what they do is research. And I think the REF is unhelpful in that, because it does kind of encourage institutions to try and squeeze everybody into that research box. So, in a way, through this conversation, we are getting policymakers, people literally in charge of funding bodies or in senior positions in funding bodies, to reflect on the exercises such as REF and its implications on practice research currently. For artist Charlotte Hoyt, the foregrounding of research over practice in the academy also raises workload challenges. A lot of practitioners foreground their papers, so their research papers are an articulation of their practice, and what's submitted as an output is their research paper, and that means there's a double done workload, so I think it's very difficult. It is certainly something that may apply to certain areas. The next section is called Creating Practice Research, and there is a quote here that I particularly love reading because I find it to be a very beautiful piece of writing by Merlin Sheldrake, who is a biologist. He published a book called Entangled Life, How Fun We Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds and Shape Our Futures. And I think that that passage here summarizes everything so neatly, so I'm just going to read it. Part of writing up research is scrubbing it clean of the blights of fancy idle play and the 1,000 trials and errors that give rise to even the smallest of findings. There was something embarrassing about admitting that the tangle of our unfounded conjectures, fantasies, and metaphors might have helped shape our research. Regardless, imagination forms part of the everyday business of inquiring. Science isn't an exercise in cold-blooded rationality. Scientists are, and have always been, emotional, creative, intuitive, whole human beings, asking questions about a world that was never made to be catalogued and systematized. So basically, the thing that Merlin Sheldrake describes as something embarrassing about admitting that all of this was going on throughout our research is what practice research as a field can embrace and foster, and we can learn from it. In terms of terminology, this is quite technical. This was mainly in our reports to distinguish between different words that we use across the reports, particularly report 2. However, I believe it's very important because several conversations I got involved in on practice research, especially within institutional context and especially in preparation for REF 2021, in which I took an active role. There was quite a lot of confusion and what Bruce Brown described as model thinking. So we believed it was important to distinguish different terminologies. So practice research is an umbrella term, as I mentioned, and it describes different manners of research, different discipline-specific formulations, unique and distinct balances of practice, research narrative, and complementary methods. The term practice research even capitalize it in general usage in common with other research fields, such as quantitative research. Research narrative is what articulates the research inquiry that has emerged in practice. In a practice research output, a research narrative can be conjoined with or embodied in practice. By this, what we mean is, if it's embodied in practice, it's a rabbit duck thing. You can look at something, see it as practice, or you can look at something, see it as practice research. Then say conjoin, it could be that you've got your practice, like, for example, the surgery methods that Professor Abigail Woods and Professor Roger Newborn were using, and writing a paper about this, and the two things together form part of research narrative. Research type or research field is what is like qualitative, quantitative practice research. Research item type is a digital container for the output. Some of you may have used institutional repositories, places to preserve your research and disseminate it to wider public. And these usually ask you to choose an item type for your research. It's a digital container like journal article, design, project, performance, conference, proceedings. And that's the item type, which is separate than a compositional structure, which is the content of the research, the detailing of research narrative and or practice. So these could be the same thing, these could be separate, these could be brought together in the context of research, practice research project. The compositional structure can be contained within a research item type. And by format, this is probably the most straightforward one, being in things like PDF, ZIP, XLS, XML, WAV, docx, MP4, exe, etc. All the digital types. So, all practice research, it's safe to say, includes or embodies a research narrative where practice is a significant method of research in research outputs. Practice research is both practice and research narrative as one output, and that doesn't necessarily have to be two separate elements. So for practice research, we need to have the practice there, but the research narrative either embodied with it or accompanying it as one output. In terms of compositional structure, how to create practice research outputs, it may vary depending on the research inquiry. As I mentioned, in some cases, you can look at the practice and you can get research narrative, which is just looking at all experience with practice, feeling it. In other cases, an additional narrative may be employed in parallel to the practice. A research narrative may incorporate documentation, such as filming or photographing of practice, of an exhibition, for example, as a proxy for practice. So this is another contentious field. For some practice researchers, it's useful to have reference guidelines for structuring research outputs. For some others, it's very limiting. Therefore, we took another risk with this report and said, here's a proposed one. Nobody has to use this, but if people find it useful, they can follow these. This is especially relevant for researchers and institutions where there's no structural and systematic support for practice research. Obviously, support and guidance in this area varies depending on where you are. If you're in a bigger institution or an institution with more money or more awareness, then you may have support that you may need. You may have professional networks. Or if you're not affiliated with an institution or a smaller institution or an institution where there's not much practice research going on, then it can be an isolated place. So part of this arises from the fact that some researchers may find this useful and some may decide to completely undo it and say, this is not the way I'm going to go about it, which is perfectly valid. So we suggested a summary or abstract, some context or introduction to the project, research inquiry, questions that arise in practice, method statements. And then practice, the description of practice or documentation of practice, insights, discussions of ways of knowing, and conclusions, references. So the importance of guidance and support is not only important for practice researchers, but also for doctoral students. Practice researchers require institutional support in the form of specific facilities, guidance, and training, and this applies to doctoral students. Practice researchers often require institutional support to transition from professional practice to practice research. And if we think about the honest conversation that we need to have about the validity of practice, us trying to fit practice into practice research, and us needing to move away from that. And then some researchers will require institutional support to do that transition. There's a need for targeted funding to create guidelines and resources surrounding practice researcher PhDs, practice research PhDs in England. And guidance is usually quite inconsistent and sometimes out of date, things mentioning cassette tapes and things like that. So it would be a good project to establish a cross-institutional initiative to look at this and establish consistent guidelines for PhD students. And research assessments in institutions are an important driver for practice research. Usually practice research outputs are put together for rec. That is important to sustain the support, but practice research needs consistent support beyond the research assessments, beyond the tick boxing exercises. And there's a clear economic argument for supporting this in academic institutions. I don't know how we're doing the time, so just need to check the time. Okay, so it's meant to be an hour, so maybe we only did a bit of moving and just a bit of chit-chatting for 5 minutes. So if you think about some of the challenges that practice researchers may encounter in academy or outside academy, and maybe raise some of those. I've got some on the slides as well, and that may break up the conversation a little bit because I appreciate an hour is quite long. So how do you feel about doing that, based on what you've heard? Yeah. Okay, so why don't we have a little chat, like 5 minutes, and then if you come up with like 3 or 4 things, then I'll take it from there and continue. Does that sound okay, Melanie? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So, yeah, 17 past, I'll call everyone to stop talking, but enjoy the conversation, maybe stretch a bit.